is a 1991 BMW 750iL, and it's an ultra-luxury sedan that caused a huge stir when it first came out. That's because this car has a V12 and a lot of other impressive technology that sent Mercedes-Benz back to the drawing board, delaying the arrival of the next S-Class so they could catch up to BMW. Today, 30 years later, I'm going to review the 750iL. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for modern cool cars. If you're looking to sell a cool modern enthusiast car, Cars and Bids is the place you'll get the most money and the most visibility for your cool car. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, we have amazing variety daily auctions of incredibly cool cars. Check it out, Cars and Bids, at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this 750iL from a viewer here in Orange County in Southern California, and I'm going to start with a little background. Now, back in the 1970s and 80s, BMW was nothing like what it is today. It had nowhere near the name recognition of Mercedes-Benz or the full product lineup or the reputation for quality or luxury. The original BMW 7 Series tried to compete with the Mercedes S-Class as a full-size luxury sedan, but nobody was really convinced. And then, in the late 1980s, BMW came out with this. This is called the E32 7 Series by BMW enthusiasts, and its arrival was a huge deal. For one thing, it was the first mainstream luxury sedan to offer a V12 engine, and the V12 surprised Mercedes-Benz, so much so that it caused them to delay the arrival of their next generation S-Class while they re-engineered it to accommodate a V12 of their own to compete with the 7 Series. But it wasn't just the V12 that made this car special. It also debuted a lot of other new technology at the time that set this 7 Series apart from the aging S-Class, and it helped cement BMW's increasing reputation as a true luxury car rival to Mercedes-Benz. These days, finding a nice E32 7 Series is hard, especially with the V12, but that is exactly what this car is. So today I'm going to review it. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of it and show you all of the interesting quirks and features of the flagship BMW luxury sedan from 30 years ago. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DOUGSCORE. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 750iL by getting in, and I want to start with the door panel, and specifically this little piece. You can lift it up and there's a storage area in there with 3 little velvet slots. Now, you would think they would just let it be an open storage area so you could put what you want in it, but not the Germans. You must put something that fits in these slots. So bizarre. And next up, moving further inside, I want to talk seats. This car had power seats, no surprise given its luxury status, and they were also heated seats, again pretty standard for a luxury car of its day. One cool thing, you had memory seats in this car, which wasn't really all that common. 3 different memory settings that you could choose, which was a nice feature. And you also had power lumbar adjustment in this car. You press this little switch next to the heated seats and you could make the lumbar go in or out. A lot of cars had lumbar adjustment back in the early 90s. Very few had it power with a switch. The 750iL did. And next up, another mark of a luxury car. This car has a phone, a built-in car phone, because the people who bought these back in the early 90s were titans of industry and they needed to always be reachable on the go. You must have felt so cool using this phone back in 91. Obviously, this phone no longer operates, but the mere thought of it is cool, and it's an interesting relic you can show your passengers. One item worth noting with this phone, you flip over the handset and you can see there's a little piece of paper that can come out where you can write 10 important write phone numbers if there are people whose numbers you really needed to know at any given moment. We have certainly come a long way from handwriting phone numbers on a piece of paper stuck on your phone. By the way, one other interesting thing in this area, you can see it prominently announces "Made in Japan." I'm surprised BMW allowed such a clear indication of something non-German in this car, but maybe they felt the Japanese have a German-like reputation for technology, so it was worth including that on there. And next up, another example showing how far we've come since the luxury days of the early 90s is the gear lever. For one thing, the gear lever itself, this shape is absolutely ridiculous. No luxury brand could ever get away with a gear lever anymore that looks like this. But more unusual than the gear lever is this little switch to the left that says A and M. If you push it down, you go into M, or manual mode, and then you can shift through the gears if you want. Move the lever down to 1, and you can manually shift into 2, and then 3, and then D when your RPMs climb, just like a manual car, except with no clutch pedal and with this weird looking gear lever. Obviously, all automatic transmissions now offer a manual shifting capability, but usually it's with paddles or some slick setup with the gear lever. This was a very early attempt at a auto manual transmission thing, and it's really strange. Now, speaking of strange, that little switch to the left of the gear lever, A and M, if you press it up for A, obviously that puts you back into automatic mode. The strange thing is when you put it in A for automatic, the little display in the gauge cluster that shows what gear you're in actually pops up an E. You put an M, it shows an M. You put an A, it shows an E. And next up, another weird one in here is on the windshield wiper stock. Like most wiper stocks of this era, and still now, you pull it towards you and it washes the windshield with windshield washer fluid, pretty standard. The strange part comes with this little S and arrow at the end of the stock. What exactly is that? Well, I looked it up in the owner's manual, and it describes that as intensive cleaning. So if you pull the stock toward you, that gives you normal windshield cleaning, but if you push the S, it gives you intensive cleaning. Now, I have pushed the S, nothing really happens, so I'm not sure what it does. And I'm also not sure why it's an S if it's intensive cleaning, but it is. That's another weird mystery of the 750iL, the more intense windshield cleaner function. And next up, speaking of the owner's manual, it is of course located in the glove box in this car, which is also unusually overthought. You don't just open the glove box, instead you open it and it kind of slides toward you like a tray. It's actually kind of a cool thing because it makes it easier to access whatever you have in the glove box, but probably wasn't really necessary. Most people are used to operating normal glove boxes. Still, a nice luxury touch. And next up, another overthought item in this car is the mirror dimmer. Like most modern luxury cars, this has a mirror dimmer, so you're not blinded by other drivers' lights. The strange thing is, it's not just on or off like most cars. Instead, there's a gradual adjustment so you can choose precisely how much dimming you want from your mirror. And right in the middle, you can set it to auto, and then it will choose how much dimming you should have based on how bright the lights around you are. It's, again, kind of an overcomplication of something that really just needed an on-off button. And next up, another overthought piece in this car is the ashtray and cigarette lighter. It's hidden behind this panel in the center control stack. The overthought part is that when you pull out the ashtray at the end, the cigarette lighter angles itself up to point directly at you, so it's in your line of sight and easier to reach. Again, this is a nice luxury touch, but probably not necessary. It could have just stayed straight. We still could have used it, but BMW wanted to make it as nice and as thoughtful as possible. Now, even with all that overthought German complexity in design, one thing they couldn't do with this car was make the BMW logo on the steering wheel colored. This was one of the very first BMW models to have an airbag, and in order to get the airbag to pop out, they couldn't put the colored BMW logo on the steering wheel, so instead, it's just black. Doesn't really look all that good, but you had an airbag. Although only on the driver's side did you have an airbag. On the passenger side, you had a little storage tray, so your life wouldn't be saved in a serious collision, but you could put a pencil up there, which is a reasonable trade-off. Now, with that said, one item in this vicinity, stick the car in reverse and you will notice that the passenger side mirror folds down automatically. A lot of modern luxury cars do this, but it was cutting edge back in '91. It allowed you to see where the curb was on the passenger side so you didn't scrape the wheels and so you could get as close as possible. I personally love this feature. I'm surprised to see it on a car this old. And next up, finally, we move on to the center control stack. The most interesting thing on here is this little panel in the upper right with a lot of buttons and a readout. This is the predecessor to modern BMW infotainment systems. I've shown this in a few older BMWs I've reviewed, but basically it will show you your average fuel economy, your average speed, the temperature, the time and date, all that kind of stuff that you might want to know. You don't have to calculate it yourself. Your car will do it for you. Of course, in later BMW models, this became a screen with far more information, but this is where infotainment systems kind of got started, with this little display screen and all of these buttons. Now, next to that, you have the radio. This is the original factory BMW head unit. You don't find that too often. After 30 years, people usually swap it out, but not in this case. But the most interesting thing in this center control stack undoubtedly is the climate control situation in this car. For one thing, in order to adjust the temperature, you don't have typical dials. Instead, it's wheels. You adjust these little wheels that look like Oreo cookies, and they'll tell you what temperature you're adjusting it to, hot or cold. You can see there's red and blue, and it gives actual temperature displays. Now, interestingly, this car does have automatic climate control, but only for the temperature. You still have to manually adjust the fan speed. And by the way, take a look at that dial that lets you change the fan speed. That really looks like an Oreo. I mean, seriously, that is basically an Oreo. I'm kind of hungry. I think I'm getting ready to eat the fan speed dial in the E32 7 Series. And next up, we move on to the back seat of the 750iL, which is absolutely huge. The front passenger seat is like all the way back and reclined, and you can see I still have room to sit back here. It is massive in the back of this car, and that's because it was the iL model, with L standing for long wheelbase. All the iL models had a stretch that pretty much only carried over to the back seats so that people could sit back here in bliss and get chauffeured around. And next up, another interesting item from this 750 and other BMWs from this era, the seat belts come out of the middle in back, not on the sides like basically every other car. Instead, they come out of the middle and then they buckle into this kind of odd plastic area on the door side of the rear seat. It's just backwards from basically every other car. The owner of this car told me he believes that was for first responders. So if they show up to an accident and someone is unconscious, they could easily unbuckle or cut the seatbelt at the buckle, and it would be easier than reaching over a person, so that's why they did it that way. But whatever the reason, it's certainly kind of interesting getting in the car and putting on your seatbelt over the middle of the seat. It's a little strange. And next up, another nice feature in this 750, the back seats are heated. You can see little switches here at the back of the front center console, two-stage rear seat heating. Not too many luxury cars had that back in '91, but this 750iL did. It also had rear seat climate vents, although you can see the vents themselves are tremendously small, almost laughably so, but that was a very uncommon feature at the time. Simply having any vents at all was a pretty big deal. And next up, another nice quirk of the rear seat of the 750iL. It has no cup holders back here. In fact, this car has no cup holders anywhere in the entire vehicle, but you do have a cigarette lighter and rear ashtrays on the doors. So if you're transporting your kids in the back of the 750iL, they can't drink and put their cup down somewhere, but they can smoke, which is par for the course in Germany in the early 90s, frankly. And next up, we move around to the back of the 750iL. But before we go into the trunk, I want to talk badging, because this car always made me laugh. You can see the 750iL badge on the right side of the trunk, and you can also see each number is connected, and so are the I and the L. Now, BMW did this to save money. It was easier to make one badge all connected than three individual badges, a 7, a 5, and a 0. But I've always found it funny that a car that is designed to be the standard of the world luxury car, with a phone and heated rear seats and a V12 engine, that is something they would skimp on. Just make individual badges. It probably would have cost like $1 a car. It's such a strange place to cut costs, and kind of a noticeable one but that's what they did. Anyway, next up we move on to the trunk, and you get in here and you can see, for one thing, it's just a trunk, a fairly large one, but nothing particularly unusual in terms of the cargo space. But there are some quirks worth noting back here, one of which is the CD changer. This was a factory CD changer in '91, which must have been a huge deal. CD players only started appearing in some cars in the late 80s, so to get a CD changer in '91, you really were the boss with your phone and your CD changer. Now, next up, the other notable item in the trunk is the roadside toolkit. It's mounted on the underside of the trunk lid. You kind of twist this little tab, you open it up, and then you can see all of your tools in case your luxury sedan breaks down and you want to fix something by the side of the road. A couple of interesting things here. For one, I've always liked that when you open up this toolkit, it stays flat, like it's on a table. And that way, if you're frustrated on the side of the road trying to do something, at least your tools are flat, you know where they are, they won't fly around. It's nice engineering of this feature. The other interesting thing with this toolkit is it still includes the original gloves that came with it in their original packaging, never opened. In case you wanted to do a roadside tire change, didn't want to get your hands dirty, the gloves are there. Also, the original warning triangle is included with this toolkit as well. Again, in its original packaging, never been opened. Perhaps that means this car has never broken down. Although that doesn't seem very likely, does it? And next up we move on to the front of the 750iL. A couple of interesting things before we go under the hood. One is the fact that this car has headlight washers. You can see these little spray nozzles positioned to spray directly on the headlight to wash your headlights in case they get dusty or dirty. This became a pretty common feature later in the 90s, but it was not very common in the early 90s, but the 750iL had it. The other interesting thing I find in the front of this car is the front license plate area. You can see it has the European license plate sizing on the front, and then a US plate obviously screwed in. This is interesting. BMW easily could have just put on a US size license plate holder for the US market, but they didn't. They kept the Euro one on there. Again, another interesting place to cut costs, and it looks kind of strange, but it also looks very Euro. Maybe that's what they were going for. But anyway, next we move under the hood. First, I want to talk about the hood itself, which opens in kind of a weird way. You pull the little hood release in the driver's footwell, and that gets the hood to here. To actually open it up, you then pull it from the back. It is front hinged, and that gives you access to your engine, which, of course, in this vehicle is a V12, 5-liter V12, made about 300 horsepower back when it was new. And like I said, it was a huge deal. Every S-Class, every full-size German luxury sedan before this never offered a V12 until this car. Now, the interesting thing is, when this car came out, it only offered a choice between a 6-cylinder or the V12. There was no V8 option. And that's because BMW didn't make a V8 at the time. They weren't in the business of making V8s until a few years after this car came out. They finally created one for the 540 and the 740, and it became an engine option in this car. But when this car was new, you had to pick between the paltry base model 6-cylinder or the serious V12. Now, of course, like I mentioned earlier, putting the V12 in this car was a big deal, sent Mercedes-Benz back to the drawing board to make sure they could get a V12 in their S-Class as well. And since this car, every full-size luxury sedan from Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and occasionally Audi has offered a 12-cylinder version as the flagship model. It all started right here. By the way, one other interesting item worth noting under here is the way you check the coolant. You can see behind the engine, there's a label that says cold coolant level, and then there's a little arrow. This is the reservoir for the coolant, and you can just look at the end of this arrow when the car is cold, and that is how much coolant you have. No dipstick, no unscrewing anything required. You just look there in the center of the engine bay in the back. Kind of unusual. Another unusual item on this car on the outside is the wheels. This car has nice BMW alloy wheels they're 15-inch wheels. Could you imagine putting a 15 on a modern V12 luxury sedan? The idea of it is absolutely preposterous, but back in '91, 15-inch wheels, all you needed for the flagship V12 long wheelbase luxury car in BMW's lineup. Crazy to imagine now. And so those are the quirks and features of the BMW 750iL, BMW's flagship luxury sedan back in the day. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the E32 750iL. You know, every time I drive one of these, I'm blown away, a car from this era, a luxury car, by the fact that this was at one point the standard of the world. It looks so pedestrian by modern standards. As the owner of this car pointed out, you can get all of this stuff on a Altima, on like a base Altima now. But at the time, this was a really big deal, and this was a really special car. And I remember coming out with a V12 in a car like this was a really, really big thing. On the road, feels very, very smooth, impressively so. Really, really nice to drive, no surprise, but this car has quite a bit of miles on it, 180,000, which is a ton, and yet it still retains this sort of feeling of smoothness. Now, the owner has kept this car in great shape for a vehicle with this miles, and that's probably why. But you can tell how this would have been the luxury sedan. Very solid feeling, very big, very comfortable, etc., etc. It's a very nice car. And there's very little wind noise. Impressive. 30-year-old car. I mean, luxury cars from that era, they don't have the wind noise standards that modern cars do typically. But especially one that's had 30 years to age. Seals break and wear and blah, blah, blah. Not this thing. This still feels tremendously quiet. BMW knew what they had to do with this car. You know, the S-Class, the W126 S-Class, which was the one at the time, that was a car that had an unbelievable reputation for being solid and incredibly high quality and blah, blah, blah. They had to go after that. And they did, and they exceeded it. And it wasn't until the W140 that Mercedes-Benz finally kind of took the mantle back and said, no, this is our world. Now, this car is unquestionably not as athletic as some other BMW models of this type. Even though it's a V12, and you'd think that would be the sport version, it's not really. The V12 was intended to be the Autobahn cruising version. You would just sit at 200 miles an hour and just go and go and go. That's what this is. And so acceleration wasn't really their goal. It was sort of this top-end ability to cruise. And that's exactly what this car does. That's what it's built for. Looking around this interior, it's just, again, hard to imagine that this was ever the gold standard, the best of the time. It just doesn't feel like that, you know, but it was, it really, really was. But, you know, you see there's a lot of plastic, so many buttons, nothing is that well laid out. There's no beauty, no style in this, but that was just how it was at the time. Acceleration is indeed kind of dull. Like I said before, not really an acceleration powertrain, but also the transmission. 4-speed auto and, you know, an old one, they shift slowly. That wasn't really the intent, was performance. With that said, 300 horsepower in a car this size, it still feels relatively quick, but it's not a fast car. I wouldn't call it a really fast car by any means. The steering and handling is the same sort of situation. It's just, it doesn't feel all that fast. It's not a quick car to steer. There's body roll. It's just not a tremendously impressive car from a, you know, dynamic standpoint. And you could just imagine 30 years ago getting this car and just being the tycoon, the titan of industry with your car phone, screaming orders into it as you drive around in your, what was at the time even, 100,000 plus car 30 years ago, which is pretty impressive. And so that's the 1991 BMW 750iL. This car is a relic, a BMW from a totally different era than the BMW you know today. This was before SUVs, before infotainment systems, before electric cars. It was BMW fighting to prove that they deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as Mercedes-Benz, and it worked. And now it's time to give the 750iL a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the E32 looks fine, never as nice looking as its successor, the beautiful E38, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is in the 7+ second range, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is okay, not great. It's a big sedan with 30-year-old parts, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is low. It's fun in the sense that it's sort of an old relic luxury sedan, but it's not particularly fast or sporty, so it gets a 3 out of 10. Cool factor is also okay. It's mainly cool for being the V12 version, and a rarely seen version of the 7 Series, and it gets a 4 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 16 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It had great tech then, but it's behind by modern standards, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is fine, the interior is nice enough, but a 30-year-old BMW V12, yikes, it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are cheap, really cheap, but they're also largely unremarkable except for the V12 up front. It's a cool car, but no icon, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 27 out of 50. Added up in the DOUGSCORE is 43 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. The E32 7 Series sent Mercedes back to the drawing board, but ultimately the S-Class is and was a better car as proven here. Still, the E32 is a cool car to check out, and there aren't many of these left in nice shape.